Ah, Puerto Rico, la isla del encanto. When many people think of Puerto Rico, they think of sandy beaches, palm trees, and their official drink, the piña colada. When I think of Puerto Rico, I think of these things too. But I also think of the people, the Borinqueños, their enduring spirit, and the wasted potential of a people and a place that have never been free to determine their own present or future. That's not to say Puerto Rico is not wonderful and beautiful, but it is certainly not because they have been owned by another faraway country for over half a century. It is in spite of this that the wonder and beauty of Puerto Rico shines through. This whole idea of colonialism was just an obscure concept to me until a couple years ago. Actually, a couple years ago this week. I knew Puerto Rico was a U.S. territory. I knew about colonialism all over the world. I knew the country I've called home my whole life was started with 13 colonies that sought freedom in a new land while stripping so many indigenous Americans of their freedom and land. But until I actually experienced what a colony was like, saw the effects of a beautiful place that had been neglected, forgotten about, and abused for over 500 years, I never really had an idea of what colonialism actually was. I'll never fully understand, because I've never lived it, but I was around it long enough, around the most obvious example of colonialism that exists today, to vow to continue to speak out about it every chance I got. So, Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory since 1899, Hawaii, a U.S. state since 1959, and a small school in Punishi, Saskatchewan. What do these places, thousands of miles away from each other, have in common? What are the effects of colonialism? What can we do about it? Let's find out as we explore and connect the dots of colonialism right down the rabbit hole. We cannot begin a deep dive into colonialism without acknowledging the original colonialism of this land and the original inhabitants of it. The land now occupied by the United States was once home to tens of millions of indigenous peoples, among them the Taino, Kanaka Maoli, the Oceti-Sakowin, and Wapikuti peoples. It is their land and space that we now occupy, and this episode is made in honor and respect to them and their stories. In 1898, after the Spanish-American War, the United States acquired Puerto Rico, the spoils of war. Puerto Rico had been a Spanish territory since 1493, when Christopher Columbus arrived and brought disease, displacement, and Africans being forced into slavery. By the time the U.S. took ownership of the island, the unique fusion of European, African, and the indigenous peoples, the Taino, had come together to form a distinct Puerto Rican identity, sometimes called Boricua, after the Taino name for the island, Borinquen. Puerto Ricans had become citizens in 1917, but over a century later, there's not a lot to show for it. Puerto Rico has a non-voting delegate in the House, and the island is crumbling after years of neglect following 2 major hurricanes, multiple earthquakes, and a 15-year recession. How can a place so rich in resources and diverse in people be in such dire financial straits, unable to pay their bills, with crumbling roads and infrastructure, skyrocketing poverty, and a mass exodus of residents moving stateside for opportunity? There are many reasons for these problems, but the main reason is that Puerto Ricans simply have not been able to budget for their problems and form a revenue stream that meets that budget. The reason? The colonialist U.S. Congress and President controls policy, purse strings, and with those, their pursuit of happiness on the island. A major example of this is with taxes. Puerto Ricans do not pay federal income tax. That is true, but they do pay federal payroll taxes for Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment. Even still, they are not eligible for supplemental security income, which is available to residents of the 50 United States as a benefit of paying said payroll taxes. Now, supplemental security income provides additional income through the Social Security program to people who are elderly, blind, and with disabilities who make less than $533 a month. So while the regular Social Security safety net is available for retired Social Security recipients in Puerto Rico, the supplemental security income safety net is not available to those who are impoverished and residents with disabilities. Now, while U.S. legislative policy is supposedly written to pull residents of the 50 U.S. states out of poverty, or at least prevent them from going into poverty, it's pretty apathetic about Puerto Ricans falling into or living in poverty. With almost half of Puerto Ricans living below the poverty line, there has been no urgency amongst U.S. politicians to change this situation for the better. These kinds of disparities are common in colonies like Puerto Rico. The owner takes advantage of the resources, in this case money, and gives very little back to the people and land. Very little. Here's where we really go right down the rabbit hole and see how we got to where we are today, and can begin to see the economic whiplash the people and government of Puerto Rico have experienced over the past few decades. Now, for most of the 20th century, the U.S. government gave tax incentives for corporations to locate subsidiaries in Puerto Rico. In 1976, Section 936 of the U.S. Tax Code was passed by the U.S. Congress. This, along with a business-friendly Puerto Rican tax code, resulted in no corporate income tax for qualifying corporations. In addition to not paying corporate income tax, additional tax incentives were given to companies that employed Puerto Ricans and companies that held profits in Puerto Rican banks for specified time periods. In the time that Section 936 was in effect, the Puerto Rican economy grew only slightly slower than the U.S. economy as a whole. But it was still growth, and a lot of it was in manufacturing, particularly pharmaceutical manufacturing. Now, this is not to say that the situation was ideal. Ideally, Puerto Ricans would be able to determine for themselves what their future would be. But with Section 936, the island enjoyed a time of relative growth, some prosperity, and financial stability. Unfortunately, Puerto Rican banks were not required to pass the additional funding in their accounts to further stimulate the Puerto Rican economy through personal and commercial loans and investments. So the full potential of the tax benefits were not realized. Now, the fact that we're even discussing the positive impact of enticing corporations to Puerto Rico if they provide jobs, while paying Puerto Ricans a lot less than those jobs would otherwise pay in an actual state, is an example of how colonialism distorts our view of what is right and moral with regard to the people of Puerto Rico and other colonies, for that matter. We threw breadcrumbs at them, and the U.S. corporations benefited through tax incentives and paying lower wages, and we call it a relative success. So Section 936 helped a little, but in 1996, the federal government and the recently elected Republican Congress, in their contract with America, which did not include Puerto Rico, decided that the cost for even these meager economic benefits was too much and decided to wind down Section 936 tax benefits over a 10-year period of time. By the end of the 10-year period, in a surprise to almost no one, the island fell into a recession that it still has not had the means or ability to climb out of. Now, much of the reason for this is due to another section of the tax code, Section 957, which redefined Puerto Rico as a foreign country for purposes of corporate income tax. With Section 957, corporations could get similar benefits to Section 936 without having to employ Puerto Ricans or invest in Puerto Rican banks. So by the end of the 10-year phase-out period of Section 936, Puerto Rico's GDP and labor force participation was in a free fall that continues to this day. In addition, the population of the island has declined from over 3.8 million and growing in 2000 to 3.1 million and shrinking quickly today. The tax situation is just one way the United States abuses its power in the relationship with Puerto Rico. At different times, depending on the whim of the U.S. government, and this is all three branches, Puerto Rico may be considered a state, a territory, a completely separate entity altogether, or some hybrid in between. Each president and each Congress have a different way of dealing with the island and its residents, and this leads to the kind of financial whiplash that causes major recession and debt. What to do about Puerto Rico always seems to be misguided in its intent. It usually involves how to get Puerto Rico out of debt while still extracting as many resources as possible out of the people and the land.
Experience covering Greece for the last 6 years is that if you don't put pressure on a government to reform itself, and by the way, you could punish the bondholders to zero, and Puerto Rico would still be in trouble because they still can't pay their debts. They have to do some very, very tough decisions that thus far they have refused to do. And if you take the pressure off from these other payments, they're even less likely to do them. Why would you want to give them that breathing room when they really need to make some hard decisions?
We don't take the pressure off. That's actually what our bill does. We have a very strong control board that's going to impose some great fiscal restraint on the island.
And what we think is best for the Puerto Rican people. But it is never about listening to over 3 million residents of Puerto Rico and letting them decide what is best for themselves. So you basically end up with two camps, with a lot of space and outcomes in between. One wants to do what they think is best for Puerto Rico, but never seriously asks Puerto Ricans what that may mean for them. The other is fine with the continuation of the plundering of Puerto Rican resources and never even feigns to care about what may be good for the island and its people. Because Puerto Rican sovereignty and self-determination is not important to either camp, the former camp, while well-intentioned, is often afraid of being seen as weak fiscally and giving a bailout to the people of Puerto Rico. After all, both camps are colonialist by nature and are apathetic or in denial about the fact that they don't actually care what happens with Puerto Rico, so long as it continues to be under the control of the U.S. government and we don't have to spend a lot of our resources on the island. One way this was evident was in the report commissioned by the Clinton administration and published by the Bush administration in 2007. The report listed as an option, perhaps not a serious one, but an option nonetheless, the ability to transfer Puerto Rico to another sovereignty. Basically, if we didn't feel it was profitable for us to continue to keep Puerto Rico as a territory, we could just give it to someone else and get the island and its 3 million residents off our hands. Now, I honestly don't think this was a viable option in the report at the time, but the fact that we would even list it as an option in an official government report tells you just how grossly immoral our abusive relationship with Puerto Rico has been. And sadly, this is not the last time this option would be floated. Now, misguided efforts have recently been made by the U.S. government to restore Puerto Rico's financial health. PROMESA, the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, was passed in 2016. The intent of the act was to form a financial oversight board that would restructure debt through a process similar to bankruptcy. But the actual effect of the board has been to further Puerto Rico's suffering infrastructure, limited safety net programs, and education and healthcare systems. Basically, the board has implemented austerity measures to pull Puerto Rico out of debt by slashing budgets to help pay for debts incurred to investors in the United States. But Puerto Rico, so lacking in tax revenues and unable to come up with their own funding to stimulate the economy, is still mired in recession and needs investment, not austerity. And these austerity programs weren't just for Puerto Rico's debt. They would extend, are you ready? For aid to disaster relief. In September of 2017, on the heels of another major hurricane just 2 weeks earlier, Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico and caused an estimated $90 billion of physical damage. 3 weeks later, President Donald Trump requested a loan program set up in the amount of $4.9 billion to provide loans for infrastructure and basic functions. This clearly didn't help, as 3 months after the hurricane, 45% of Puerto Ricans still had no power and 14% had no running water. Repeatedly describing the island as a den of thieves, the president opined shortly after the hurricane if we could sell Puerto Rico and divest of that asset.
Wow, yet another big storm heading to Puerto Rico, he tweeted. Will it ever end?
I tell you, Puerto Rico, but you've thrown our budget a little out of whack.
Today, with storm preps underway, he blasted the island as one of the most corrupt places on Earth.
While other states hit by major hurricanes and disasters that same year would receive funding quickly with no strings attached, the colonialist owner of Puerto Rico, with its racist colonialist president, sought to squeeze any profit out of the territory possible, even in its worst time of need. Ultimately, Congress would pass aid totaling $66 billion for Puerto Rico, but as of last month, 41 months after Hurricane Maria hit, only $17 billion of that $66 billion had actually been distributed. The reason for this is because unlike U.S. states that received funding with no strings attached, Puerto Rico had to account for each and every dollar that it would spend before it got the money. Even worse than the property and financial toll was the human toll. Now, while a smaller number of people may have actually died as a direct result of the hurricane, around 3,000 Puerto Ricans lost their lives as a result of the extremely slow recovery and neglect from its owner, the Republican federal government of the United States. So we can clearly see the effects of colonialism and how they can be devastating, particularly so when the colonists are racist and speak of those who are colonized in financial terms and not human terms. But what can be done about it, particularly with regard to Puerto Rico? On our next episode, we'll explore some of the options for Puerto Rico's future and look at some other places affected by colonialism. Join me next week, right down the rabbit hole. If you like what you see, like, subscribe, and share with your friends. See you next time.